So I'd like to finish this last part of the lecture just talking about some of the other, we've mostly talked about the Bretons and the Corsicans so far, some of the other nationalist movements that exist in France that are relatively small, even in comparison to the Breton and Corsican movements. So I'm not sure if you recognize this flag. This is the flag of the Basque country. When we think of the Basques, traditionally we think of the Basque being a region in northern Spain, which it is, but you can see here this area in yellow is the traditional Basque territory. And part of it extends north of the border into France. The Basque lands, so Basque culture is very interesting. The Basque language is a language isolate, which means it's not related to any other language that we know of. So it makes it a very unusual European language in that sense, and it kind of reinforces the distinct Basque identity that exists in northern Spain and southern France. Historically, the Basque country was part of the Kingdom of Navarre, which itself, and you can see from the geography here, was kind of on the border of France and Spain, was not always part of the French kingdom at various times in its history, and actually prior to the French Revolution had a great deal of local autonomy, because the Kingdom of Navarre had historically been separate from France. With the onset of the Revolution, many of these local rights or these concessions to local autonomy were stripped away. And for most of the 19th century, Basque nationalism really kind of was a very minor force on the political scene. Of course, we talk about Basque nationalism, we associate it much more with Spain, which brings me to our only Jeopardy question today, this terrorist group. So this organization demanding Basque independence led a terrorist campaign between 1968 and 2009 against the Spanish state. And that was ETA, standing for Free Basque Homeland in the Basque language. This is the ETA organization. During the course of their campaign, they killed about 900 people, or at least they were responsible for the deaths of 900 people. And they declared a ceasefire in 2008. They did not carry out attacks in France, precisely because they wanted to have an area, a Basque area, they could kind of slip across the border and basically not annoy the French authorities who might try and pursue them as well. So the ETA themselves did not attack the French state, but they did inspire the creation of an organization. Here's its symbol here, the Apatarak, which means Northerners in Basque, and that did murder some French policemen in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Once detonated a bomb at an airport just before Francois Mitterrand arrived as president to warn him that he was not paying enough attention to the autonomy of the French Basques. Although this organization has largely stopped, has kind of ceased to exist since about the year 2000. One of the things that has gotten Basque nationalists kind of excited in France in recent years, and we'll see this elsewhere as well, is the realignment of French geographic and regional divisions. So most of the Basque country here is in the Pyrenees-Atlantiques department, and what the Basques have been calling for in recent years is for this department to be split in two, and the western part essentially recognised as Basque country in France. So that kind of forms about the extent of nationalist sentiment that most Basque people are willing to endorse, that their own Basque region be recognised through the creation of a new department. There have been organisations that have kind of advocated for Basque autonomy, a variety of them. They kind of come under the electoral banner, the EHBI, which basically translates as yes to a Basque homeland, although they're not particularly advocating for full independence as opposed to greater regional autonomy. And the other way in which Basque identity has been kind of enhanced, and something we've seen elsewhere, especially in Brittany, is the advent of Basque language schools. So schools where children can be educated entirely through Basque have been created in recent years and have allowed kind of Basque identity to kind of flourish in that sense. Another nationalist separatist group in France is the old province of Alsace. We've come across Alsace lots of times, obviously over the course of this lecture. It was kind of involved in a tug of war between France and Germany over the course of the 19th and 20th century. Actually, Alsace changed hands between France and Germany, or some German state, 5 times between 1681 and 1945. So it's kind of always been involved in this tug of war. The local language in Alsace traditionally was German, or very much a clear dialect of German. This is an example here of some Alsace language, and you can see on the one hand it looks obviously pretty close to German, but you can see some French influence in there as well. And the Basque language, the Alsace language, has survived in Alsace. So well into the 20th century, as late as 1900, over 90% of the population of Alsace spoke the Alsace language, although in some ways that's perhaps not all that surprising when we bear in mind that in 1900, of course, Alsace was part of Germany. And it's really only in the wake of the Second World War that the language has begun to tail off, although in terms of percentage, it's still the most widely spoken regional language of France, and over 40% of people to this day still speak Alsace. And it's after the Second World War, there was actually a small movement in Alsace demanding that Alsace break off from France and join with other parts of Switzerland and Germany to form an Alemannic Germanic state. So there is a dialect of German called the Alemannic dialect, a subset of German, and Alsace falls into that. So there were at least some people who wanted a new state to be formed that would involve Alsace, I think part of Switzerland, part of Germany, but not really much came from that demand. The most obvious way in which Alsace identity has been recognized in recent years, and goes back to, again, the decision by Francois Mitterrand in 1982 to create new regions of France. So when this was done in 1982, let me just get this going here, we can see that Alsace was recognized as one of the regions of France. It was given its own regional identity, and that seemed to satisfy most people in Alsace of its kind of own autonomy. But when the French government too decided to redesign the boundaries of the province of the regions in the decision was announced in 2014. The map came into effect in 2016. You see that Alsace disappears into the wider region of Grand Est, and this did annoy a lot of Alsacians who felt that their own kind of distinct Alsace identity was undermined. An Alsace autonomous group called Unser Land, Our Land, had been established in 2009 to advocate for greater regional autonomy for Alsace, and they began pushing back and demanding that Alsace would be restored to its regional identity. The French government actually announced this year that Alsace would be restored not as a region but as a department within France. But Unser Land have argued that this is not enough, that more needs to be done to preserve the Alsace language and to respect Alsace identity and Alsace political autonomy within the French state. And perhaps the last significant region I want to look at in this discussion of regionalism in France is Occitania, the southern third of France, that historically had its own language, although Occitanian, sometimes known as Provençal or provincial, is it's basically a Romance language. In some ways, it's a lot more similar to French than Alsace or Basque or Breton, which are very, very separate. For most of its history, certainly the French state considered the Occitan language to be nothing more than bad French, and the Occitan itself is actually broken into several different dialects. Over the course of the 19th century, the French state very much discouraged the use of what they called a patois, meaning kind of a backward local language. So they'd even, unlike Breton, which everyone understood was a different language, the French state insisted that Occitan was simply just peasant, poor French, and should be discouraged. And this is what is a controversial topic in southern France still, what's known as Vergona. Vergona translates as shame, and basically the sense of shame that speakers of Occitan were made to feel for speaking their own language, made to feel it was a backwards, kind of ignorant language only spoken by stupid people. However, in the 19th century, kind of echoing movements we've seen elsewhere, there was a greater move towards recognizing the literary value, because Occitan, unlike some of the other languages, had a very, very rich literary tradition, dating back into medieval times, and an organization called L11 P5. The pupil was established by a series of writers in Occitan, the most famous of whom was Frédéric Mistral. And Mistral is famous because he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1903 for his writings in French and in Occitan. So their main focus was not to develop Occitan independence, but to try and encourage, particularly what Lefebvre wanted to establish was a standard way of writing Occitan. As I mentioned, Occitan is spoken in several different dialects, oftentimes with local varieties of how things are spelled, and they were trying to create a standard way of writing the Occitan language. This is, I want to show you this here. This was an Occitan flag created in the 20th century. So the big cross in the middle was the old cross of the Count of Toulouse, and the 7-pointed star in the corner was the Star of Lefebvre, and the 7 points in particular represented the 7 riders who established it. There was a movement towards Occitan independence led by this guy here, Francois Fanton, who published a book after the Second World War called Ethnice, where he basically argued that every ethnic identity and every language community should have its own separate political state, that the best way to kind of ensure peace in human society is for each language community to have its own separate state. So he, in 1948, actually proclaimed Occitania to be an independent republic, although not that anyone really paid much attention. And he helped establish in the 1960s the Parti de la Nation Occitania, the Occitanian National Party, demanding independence for Occitania within the context of what eventually became the European Union. Again, this party has been pretty small, hasn't had really any success in elections. In 1987, a new party, the Parti Occitan, emerged. This was demanding not independence but autonomy for Occitania, but again has had very little success politically. However, there has been some success for Occitanian nationalists. In 2011, some local officials drew up a statement that they felt represented the values of those who embrace an Occitanian identity, which meant preserving the language firstly, supporting regional identity and culture as well, and it asked candidates in local elections in southern France to advocate its manifesto. Bastille means to build, so let's build Occitania. And they actually, under this label, candidates under the Bastille label have had some success in local elections, and this kind of manifests itself again. We're starting to see more and more bilingual signs in the south of France, and what we're also starting to see is the emergence of Occitanian schools. So I think the figures in the lecture notes I have is about 68 elementary schools that are bilingual in teaching Occitanian and French, and about 3 high schools catering to just under 4,000 students. So again, echoing features we've seen elsewhere, the emergence of a greater linguistic identity being expressed in the form of schools, educating through that language. And as elsewhere, the part that's been most interesting has been the use of regional identities to try and create a new Occitanian political unit. We talked about the creation of regions in France in 1982, the effort to kind of combine some of these regions in 2014. So Occitania had essentially been divided between the Midi-Pyrenees and Languedoc-Roussillon in 1982. Occitanian politicians advocated, when France was redrawing its regional boundaries, to simply merge these two into one single territory known as Occitania, which the French state agreed to do. And so in 2016, Occitania became recognized as a region of France. But actually this provoked its own controversy, because this is Catalonia, mostly situated in Spain, but you can see a little part, the dark green in the north is in around the city of Perpignan, is in the southeast of France. And of course that's exactly in the same region, Perpignan, that has now become Occitanian. Traditionally, the Catalan language was seen as a dialect of Occitanian. It's become seen as much more separate in recent years, and actually when this decision was made to create the new region of Occitania in 2016, there was pushback on the part of the Catalans, who went on protest through the streets of Perpignan, chanting, "We are Catalan, we are not Occitanian, our language and our blood will not change." And so they kind of pushed back against this, and they're demanding that the region be renamed Occitania / Pays de la Catalogne, so the Occitanian and Catalonian land. And in some ways, the Catalonian protest against this kind of recognition of Occitanian identity kind of reflects in microism what's happening in France on a macro scale, where we have these national identities demanding greater recognition. What will this lead to in the future? Will we see significant nationalist movements in France akin to Catalan and Catalan and Scottish nationalism? It's hard to say. Certainly in Corsica, it looks like something like that might be starting to emerge. But what is important is that the raw materials for a nationalist movement certainly exist in several corners of France. I'm finishing here with the picture of a book by a guy called Benedict Anderson called Imagine Communities. Very influential book about nationalism. Anderson basically argues that nationalist identity is essentially imagined, that people pick various aspects of a language, a culture, a shared history, whatever it is, to kind of create their idea of a nation. And for France, there certainly is the raw materials that in the right circumstances in the future, there could be a nationalist who identify not being French but being part of this other identity and begin to push for some kind of separation from France. So from now, perhaps not likely, but the raw material is there that this could happen in France in the foreseeable future.